Thank you, everyone, for showing up tonight. I would like to introduce to you Wisconsin Swimming Safe Sport Chair, Dr. Mona. She's going to do a presentation for us on psychosocial safety in competitive sports. Thank you, Mona.
Awesome, thank you. Thanks everybody for joining. I know Sundays aren't always the time when we have lots of things available, or we have so many different commitments on Sunday nights, so it's difficult to kind of attend. So today I'll talk a little bit about psychosocial safety in competitive sport, and I'm going to frame it around the safe sport, how we deal with safe sport at USA Swimming and Wisconsin Swimming. So just to kind of thinking about it, get us started, I will not ask you to share in the chat. I'm going to give you an opportunity just to think about what comes to mind when you think about psychological safety in sport. What are the different words that you kind of think about that you would think that what it would look like if that's something that you come across? While you think about it, I'm going to welcome you to this presentation. And today what I will do is I will blend some research-backed insights with practical strategies, how we can promote psychological safety and fun swimming environment. I hope you leave this presentation with the foundational understanding of what is psychological safety and why it's important in swimming and indeed in all sports. And hopefully I can give you some practical strategies that you can promote and use either as a coach, as a parent, official, or LSC leader. So this is kind of targeted for different kind of audiences. But before I get started, I'll tell you a little bit about who I am. So my name is Mona Arvinen-Barrow. I got a bunch of letters right behind my name. So I'm a British Psychological Society chartered psychologist. I'm also a certified mental performance consultant for in the United States by ASP, and then I had the same designation from my native Finland. I currently work as an associate professor in sport and performance psychology at UWM, and I provide mental performance services to athletes with UWM and within the community. But today I sit here in my role as a Wisconsin Swimming Safe Sport Chair. And to kind of couple that, I also have a background as a USA Swimming certified official. I'm a swim parent, and I'm a former professional figure and synchronized skating coach and a competitive athlete. Why did I share so much? Well, I think what I want to share that is to show that the ways in which I approach sport is basically looks at from all of the different layers of what sport is. So sport happens as we as athletes in the middle, and those athletes are influenced by lots of different systems. One of them is the interpersonal microsystem immediately around it. So in that, we have family and friends and parents, coaches, teachers, teammates, and people like me, sports psychology practitioners. Above that, we sit in an institutional mesosystems, one of which is Wisconsin Swimming and all the different clubs that all of you represent, as well as Safe Sports sits as an institutional mesosystem, which affects all of us, those people around the athlete, as well as the athlete directly. All of that sits in a cultural systems where all of our cultural norms, traditions, and values, things like media and things play a role. And above that sits different systems, which include laws and policies and access, such as U.S. Center for Safe Sport. And we all, as a humans and everybody around the globe, we sit in the systemic, sort of higher environmental, historic, and chronosystems. And some of those systems has affected us quite heavily. And in recent years, most notably, COVID pandemic was one of those big systems that affected how we do sports through all of those different layers. But I really wanted to highlight that as somebody who sits here as the Safe Sport Chair, I am kind of like part of the institutional system, as well as drawing from all of those different roles that I've had as from the interpersonal system level, as being a coach, being also a sports psych practitioner. I'm a parent, and I kind of try to look at that sport from all of those layers while being very mindful of the laws and policies that exist even above Wisconsin Swimming and USA Safe Sport. So if we look at what safe sport is, and I'm not going to bore you with the whole big thing because there's a whole lot of information about it. One of the key things that USA Swimming talks about in terms of their safe sport practices is that USA Swimming is committed to providing a healthy and positive environment free from abuse for all of its members. And it consists of lots of different things. It has a multi-layered approach. One of them is about required policies and best practice guidelines. There is a mandatory screening for all of those adults or anybody over 18 that has to go through, such as criminal background checks and employment screening. And then they provide training and education for all of those 18 and over athlete and then all non-athlete members. And one last part of that is that there's a monitoring, supervision, and mandatory reporting if we see something that kind of violates all of these guidelines. If we look at this from the perspective that there are really 4 pillars that USA Safe Sport kind of talks about. There's a physical safety component. There's an abuse, which is the prevention and reporting on any abuse that we may see, and neglect, which also has a prevention and reporting part of it. One thing that we're not really touching on any of those mandatory 4 processes from the prior part is the psychological safety. We talk a lot about physical safety, and a lot of our LSCs has physical safety procedures going on to make sure that those blocks are safe, nobody's cutting their toes on in any of the pool decks and so forth. But what we really don't understand or really have good guidelines for is what is the psychological safety aspect of all of this. So if we really look at it and take a deeper dive, yes, there are 3 different things that are really focused on what we do as coaches and LSC members. We are mandatory reporters, so anybody who's a USA Swimming adult member is a mandatory reporter. So by law, we have to report every suspicion of child or vulnerable adult abuse, neglect, or exploitation. And that's a law. So if we're thinking about those layers of sport, is the second highest from the top. So those policies and laws are absolutely something that we're responsible for. We also have a minor athlete abuse prevention policy, and that gives us clear guidelines on in-program contact between minors and adults. It also really specifically talks about in-program massage and in-program travel rules, and gives us very clear guidelines on how we need to lodge and have residential environment in the case that we travel somewhere. And then we have something that is very specific to our meet. So Meet 360, it has a quality control sort of reporting things and guidelines. It gives the best practice guidelines of what kind of protocols we should have. And it actually gives you sheets how to deal with meets, making sure that all of these different volunteers who are grown-ups who will be part of the meet should act so that we create a safe environment free from abuse and neglect during the meets. So if you haven't had a look at those, I think those would be really good to have a look at. Anybody who's in part of any kind of safe sport meet protocols to make sure that we do this properly and safely. When we look at the best practice guidelines that Safe Sport has established, it had 9 specific recommendations. And when I break that down and try to think about the things that are really about the psychological safety, I think there are 3 that really come up as the key ones. Everything else kind of focused on other things, but if I think about the psychological safety ones, these would be the 3 that I would pick out. One of them is about the parents should be encouraged to appropriately support their children swimming. And this one is something that I talked about the other webinar, and you can get access to that on the Wisconsin Swimming. But we don't really always know what does that appropriate support means. So what I really want to do is, if you're interested and if you are joining this webinar as a parent, take a look at that, because that kind of talks about it a little bit better and more details about what does supporting your children look like. Oh, I'm sorry, that kind of got over here. The other thing is the guidelines is coaches should avoid having athletes as their favorites. They should really avoid creating any situation that could be perceived as them having favorite. And I think the key word here is perceived, because sometimes, even though we may not intend something, some of our actions and behaviors may be perceived by others as something that puts one athlete above the other. It's not necessarily that that was the intent, but it's sometimes the perception of what looks like is sometimes more important to ensure that we don't do that. rather than what we were intending to do. So the perception, what others perceive us doing, is really important. And obviously, gift giving, providing special favors, or showing favoritism to individual athletes is absolutely discouraged. And that is another thing that makes somebody feel that perception of what's going on is that I'm special, I'm different. And if anybody who's completed the safe sport training, those actions can be perceived as potentially grooming or things like that. So I think it's really important that we recognize what are those different guidelines and what does that, what we do, behave, or how does it look like to peoples around us. All right. So that's kind of like the foundational knowledge on top of it. And now I'll move on to the actual psychological safety. So if we're thinking about it from a definitional perspective, a psychological safety is actually a climate. It's an environment that we created where people are comfortable expressing themselves truly as authentic selves. It's a climate where people actually feel safe to speak up, to make mistakes, and be fully who they are without fear of embarrassment or punishment. So if we take that definition and start thinking about it, well, think about a time when you felt safe to speak up or make a mistake. And I really want you to think about that moment and say, well, how did that make you feel? And what kind of impact did that have on you? So let's take a moment and just think about it. I would like you to share something in the chat so Angela will be able to monitor for me and see if there's any comes up. Anybody brave enough to put anything up on the chat? Probably not. Well, I would think that if I consider things that when I felt safe to speak up or make a mistake, I think it actually made me feel heard. I feel like I felt belonging. I felt something that, hey, my views have value, and that it's okay to sometimes disagree with things and still feel like I haven't lost my view or my point of view in this space. So I think that's a really important to say, that it gives us feelings and it gives us thoughts about who we are and how we interact in that space. On the flip side, the places where you haven't felt safe to do that, it often creates things like anxiety or overly stress, and then our thought starts ruminating and we get ourselves into this little vortex of things that are not necessarily very positive. Okay. So let's think about it a little bit deeper. So in the line of what the safe sport, psychological safety, there are a couple of key ingredients that are coming from the literature. So this is the results of a systematic review that looked at psychological safety in sport. And these are the key categories that kind of come on top. Most prominent is that there is a promotion of risk taking. So in order for an environment to feel safe, psychologically safe, it promotes risk taking. So in a safe way, one can take risks in their performance and they can kind of attempt something that they're not quite sure how the outcome comes. That psychological safe environments are also absent from any threat or harm. So you feel comfortable going in and you don't feel threatened. You don't feel like it's going to harm you in any way. It has positive interpersonal relationships, meaning that everybody who enters a space, you feel like you're part of them. So there's a connection between all of those people. Same way, there is positive emotional state. One might even argue that those spaces are really fun. You go in there, you feel happy, you feel accomplished, you feel motivated, you feel like your battery is full and all those kind of things. And those spaces look like they're inclusive, they're equal, and there's a respect between the people who are part of that group that is in that environment.
And Mona, we have something in the chat. Felt empowered and engaged with the situation that needed to be addressed. Felt like I was making a positive impact that helped those individuals create an opportunity for self reflection in identifying ways that the situation could have been handled better.
I think that's awesome. Like every single part of that screams psychological safety and also promotes you as a person to be able to have that voice and speak exactly how you should. So I'm awesome. That's how it should be. Like full on textbook example, I think. So let's think about this then from the perspective, what does that mean in swimming? So if we create psychologically safe spaces, looking at the literature, what it talks about all of that is athletes need a freedom to try, fail, and learn. Coaches usually thrive when they can innovate without judgment. What that means to me is that they can try new strategies, they can try new training programs, and sometimes they may not even work out and the workout wasn't the greatest, but they feel they can innovate without being judged about trying something new. Also, officials in a psychologically safe environment, they feel supported when enforcing rules for fairness at swim meets. Sometimes officials don't like to be there, and we're all volunteers because they may not feel supported when they are about to make a call. So all in all, officials are there making calls where the benefit goes still to the swimmer. But if we have a psychologically safe environment, they will also feel very supported when they make those calls. Equally, parents will feel included and valued for their efforts. So psychological safety extends from the athlete and coaches and officials to parents. Parents make a huge contribution to our sport, and we rely on volunteers heavily. And if we create psychologically safe environments, we're more likely to get those parents to participate and feel included and valued for all the efforts that they put into the swimming and the swim meets and practices and so forth. And also the LSC leaders will feel supported in creating a culture for the sport. So if the LSC leaders don't feel that it's psychologically safe for them to be part of and making those changes, then they don't necessarily want to volunteer as much because what they're trying to do is create a culture for the sport that is for the benefit of all athletes. So as we can see, every single member and the layer of the people that we have in our sports, all the way from the athlete to the supporting networks, as well as the clubs and the organizations, can benefit from having a psychologically safe environment. And that's how we can get our sport to thrive. All right. So how is psychological safety then created? It's kind of like a path and has like 4 different phases. And the first phase is all about inclusion. So when you feel included, it affords you to feel genuinely welcomed and included as valuable in the team. And it's all based on feeling at that point. The second phase is learner safety, which enables the individuals to actively engage in the process of learning and also make mistakes that help them to succeed in their role. So rather than just engaging in it, it also affords those mistakes and say that's okay. So we don't make mistakes as being bad, but it actually is a positive and encouraging process. Phase 3 of building psychological safety is the contributor safety, where individuals become significant contributors to the success of the organization or the setting. So I can see this as when an athlete feels safe. They have been actively engaging in the process and making mistakes. Then in a phase 3, they become contributors to engage in what does the safe environment looks like by welcoming those new little ones who come in or outsiders who come and join the club. And then the last phase of it is the challenger safety, where those who successfully contribute to that group or organization, they have the security to take some interpersonal risks and ask questions, which challenge some of those systems that may be in place without fear of retaliation. So the example that Angela just wrote from the chat literally talked about all of those things that the person felt that there was safety enough to challenge systems or mistakes and then how it could be done better. So thinking about your organization, beyond that one example, what of those 4 phases have you experienced? So if you don't mind, just put a little word in the chat and say, well, I've been in a space where I felt X, Y, Z. So I'll put the previous slide up so you can say, have you felt included? Have you felt that you've had the safety to learn? Or have you felt the safety to contribute or safety to even challenge the existing systems? Give it just a couple of minutes, you can have a look at there. Hope we're getting something there. Maybe I'll give you some more time just to think about it. But the question was, in organizations, what kind of safety have you kind of had in the past? Have you felt included? Have you felt safe to learn or safe to contribute to the overall culture, or even safe to challenge some of those existing systems that may have not worked as well? Okay, let's move forward. So if I break this down in for more psychological perspectives, looking at those inclusion safety, learner safety, the contributor safety, and the challenger safety, really, if we look at the phase one, so the first thing that we want to ensure is that our thoughts and perceptions and feelings are considered. So this is all very psychological in the sense that we can think what we perceive and how we feel. The safety starts from feeling and thinking about, oh, I think, these people are nice. I like how it makes me feel. And it kind of creates this overall thinking and perception and feeling safety first. Phase two, which is about the learner safety, is really focused on behaviors. So this is the one thing that I feel coaches can see often. When an athlete who's maybe a shy at first, all of a sudden starts behaving in a different way, taking more risks, that's a sign that there is some level of learner safety, that they are feeling more comfortable in that environment. Those are often easier for us to observe because they're behaviors versus having them being sort of more internalized thoughts and perceptions and how we feel about things. The level 3 then shows some outcomes of these behaviors. And so that really is once we start feeling and behaving in certain ways, so then we start getting outcomes. They might come to practice earlier. They might start getting better times at their meets and things like that. So the behaviors, when the behaviors change, then that behavior will lead to some kind of outcome change. And again, really easily observable to what the ways in which they are then getting the results of their swimming, or their stroke became better, or their touches became, and the walls became better. And then the last phase is really that they become to contribute to the growth and the change of the swimming environment and their own growth and change. So if we really look at psychological safety, it's all about first thinking and thoughts and perceptions and feelings, which then move on to, as we move on those phases, we can see it in behaviors. And those behaviors then result better outcomes, and then it puts them into a better position to contribute growth and change. Isn't that really what we want all of our athletes to do as they are little and eventually they move out to college and stuff? We want them to leave the sport from this level to be able to contribute to those different environments that they end up going.
We do have a comment.
Yes.
Thankfully, I have experienced all phases. So fortunate to have been involved with organizations, teams, or situations that foster collective development and growth.
That's awesome. That is exactly what we want to hear. And I think it's when we have those experiences, I always feel that it's our responsibility, because we've had them, to try to share that forward. So kind of talks exactly what we talked about here. When the contributor to growth and change happens, then they will be the ones who lead the other people to feel the phase one, that, hey, I feel valued. I'm genuinely welcomed and included in this space. Great. All right. So think about your previous answers to those chat questions. What thoughts and emotions and behaviors can you identify? So this is where I'm trying to break this down a little bit. I'm not going to ask you to share But thinking about all of those answers, I think that was a fantastic answer. But we can break it down further about what were you thinking, what were you feeling, and what are those behaviors that ended up being the key things that really helped you like thrive in those psychologically safe environments. Okay. So let me take a little deeper dive into the literature, what it talks about. A lot of the literature has actually really focused on coach and athlete roles in the psychological safety. And I think I understand that because that's ultimately the biggest pairing that happens when it comes to sports. Coaches and athletes spend the most time together. And really, the older the athlete gets, the less the parents are even involved. So this is kind of like the central part of what sport is or what competitive sport is. And if we look at that literature, there are three things that I think come across as the most important things. Supportive and controlling coach behaviors can both predict athletes' psychological safety. So what that means is that if a coach acts in a supportive behaviors, that will enhance psychological safety. But equally, if the coach is controlling or has controlling behaviors, that will undermine psychological safety. So what I think is really important from here to take is that the coach plays such a crucial role in either creating or diminishing a psychologically safe environment. It also, the literature talks about how this relationship between coach and athlete, the quality of that relationship, that can mediate these effects. So if a coach has a really good, strong relationship with the athlete, it can amplify the positive impact of those supportive behaviors. And it also can act as a buffer from the negative effects of controlling behaviors on psychological safety. So having a good coach-athlete relationship can have an impact on if rest of the environment is either like how it can make the psychological safe environment even safer, or it can actually buffer if this environment in general is not that safe to some of those negative effects of controlling behaviors. So having a good coach-athlete relationship is crucial for psychological safety. Equally, the athlete, the one who's at the center of all of those systems, their own influence is key. Psychologically safe coach athlete or sporting environment does not happen unless the athletes are contributing to this safe environment. So what that means is that we have to give them autonomy to be part of this journey by making them have those thoughts and perceptions and feelings and then those behaviors. So it's not just the coach who creates the environment, it is the ways in which the athletes influence that as well. And what we also know that athletes are often influenced by parents. So the ways in which the parents talk about the coaches or the other athletes or other parents in the systems can also influence the ways in which the athlete approaches that system. So when we look at the literature, I really like this article. This is really good. And I'll give everybody links to these because most of these are actually open access and free for people to read academic literature. Is that they've asked a lot of people that are part of the sporting environments, like what do they look like? And I really like this because it's not just looking at it from an athlete coach perspective, but it's really looking about it from even like safeguard officers and coaches and all of those other people who are representing the admin roles. So what that comes up with that there are 8 key optimally safe environment look like or characteristics. One of them is the positive relationships. So having positive relationship with all of the stakeholders is really crucial. So if I take this to the LSC level, the ways in which the LSC communicates with all of the clubs and the athletes and the coaches becomes really key to creating that positive relationship. So me as a safe sports chair, it's my role to be also accessible to all of the members if they need my support or my help. Welcoming environments matter. It's sometimes as simple as saying hi when somebody comes in. and making this effort to introduce yourself. So rather than assuming that the new person, who we all know what a new person looks like because we've all been new persons at some point, we wander a little bit aimlessly and not quite sure how it happened. So if we want them to feel and think that this place is awesome or that I matter, we can just go and say hi and say, hey, can I help you? I'm obviously not from America. I think Americans typically do this really well, like having this welcoming environment. I think it's awesome. But sometimes we can be even more intentional about it just because we know that that can sort of start looking like a safe environment. Equally, physical environment influences safety and enjoyment. So sometimes we can't really help this because some of our pools are pretty old and some of the toilets aren't that great and some of the things that don't actually look that inviting. So not having all of those facilities can make a place not feel as safe. So even then, I think it's really important that we who are participating or taking that environment, we try to make it as enjoyable and as inviting as we can. And that means cleaning up after ourselves, like, not leaving the goggles everywhere, not leaving all of those things lying around. So really trying to make the best of whatever facility we have, or if there is money available, obviously upgrade them a little. But that does matter. So facilities absolutely matter in how one perceives safety and enjoyment. One of the key things is also to create developmentally appropriate activities. So I think it's sometimes we have this tendency to try to push to do the next level hard. It's very common to say, hey, I think my child needs to do this and this, for example, in school, push to the next level. Sometimes it's actually better that we don't push, but we let them feel the safety, give them the environment where they feel welcomed and safe to make mistakes, which then changes their behaviors, which then actually pushes them to the next level. So sometimes the confidence comes from being great rather than constantly pushing for the next level or the next level hard. I often say it's like allow the person to enjoy the mastery for a bit before pushing for the next goal. The other four key components is shared goals and expectations. They reduce conflict. So this is really important because sometimes coaches have goals for their athletes, then athletes have goals for themselves, and then the parents have even different kinds of goals for them as well. So I think it's really important that we kind of look at it like we all share the same goal, and often that's driven by the coach and the athlete, and then the parents are part of the supporting. I also, another area is caring and competent coaches can enhance trust and safety. So paying attention and showing that you care about the person as a person and not just the swimmer is really important. And my other webinar really talks about the supportive parental involvement. That's a really important too. So it's really important that the parents are supportive. And one of my favorite statements is that I asked my child, what kind of swim parent do you want me to be? And then I follow their guidance, meaning that I wasn't allowed to cheer in the stalls. She's like, I can't hear you anyway, and it's embarrassing. So those are the things that I think are important, that you support the children the ways in which they want to be supported rather than the ways in which we want to support them. So I think there's two different ways. And friendly and supportive peers protect and include. So I think that's absolutely crucial. If the athlete isn't happy going into the environment because of the peers, they can't make performance gains. That's just a fact. So the social environment is absolutely important. And finding those peers in that pool area is what creates a psychologically safe environment. Okay. So let's move on to how can we facilitate psychological safety. I have a couple of tips for different groups. So coaches, I think one of the key ones that are consistent with the literature is normalizing mistakes. And literally saying that's part of learning. And I think we need to learn how to normalize the mistakes and not always strive for those perfect, great outcomes. Inviting athlete input in how you do it. What did you notice about that set or drill? Those are really important. I know most coaches do that already, but hopefully today kind of gets you to think about a little bit, well, actually, those are intentional and I should be doing those so I can facilitate psychological safety. Giving choices in workouts when appropriate. This is something that I say a lot to all of the rehab professionals I work with. I said, you might have 5 different activities that can all enhance range of motion in a knee joint. Give the athlete a choice to pick. Sometimes it's okay to ask them to use another one or say, here's your options, pick one. And using positive reinforcement over fear-based feedback. So anything that's like, well, next time if you don't do this, we're going to do that. That's a fear-based feedback. And that may have worked for my generations back in the 80s. It does not work these post-pandemic kids. They don't do that because what those fear-based feedbacks actually trigger is a trauma response for the fact that they were so held back because of COVID, and every control they had is no longer part of their life. So we need to really sort of recognize that all of these lack of control, when we take a control away from them, can actually be quite triggering for many who found themselves stuck at home for a year and not knowing when they get to go back to school. Officials, some of those things that we can do as officials on the pool deck, we can maintain neutrality, but show humanity by interacting with warmth and fairness with athletes. There are times when athletes may have a little too many emotions on deck when they didn't swim as well or something like that. It's okay for us to show some passion, and it's okay to say, hey, I know I know you're upset. However, I still need to enforce these rules. So I think being neutral but showing compassion and humanity is really important so that the athletes, when they are making those mistakes, they still feel safe. And model fairness and consistency. This is obviously embedded in our rules, but sometimes it's hard because we too are humans and we have emotions involved. And so create an environment where rules equal safety and not punishment. And I do think that's a really common that we do. But often it's like we can just keep on following the rules and become real rote on them. So, but I go back to the first one, just be neutral by showing some compassion at times. Parents, like I said, the other webinar really talks about different things that are focused on pre, during, and post meet. But I think these are kind of like the 4 key ones here. Focus on praise and effort, not just outcomes. So sometimes the meet outcome isn't great. Sometimes it's a little bit more focused on the effort. They're not even looking for the times. Normalize setbacks and disappointments and help athletes move on from them. You can support autonomy by allowing athletes to own their swimming. It's their sport, it's not yours. And avoid sideline coaching and by trusting the process. We have all these feedback for our athletes, but we're not the coaches. So we shouldn't be saying, oh, your shoulders went this way, or you weren't as fast in your second 50 as you were in the first one. That's for the coach to do. That's not for us. And we as LSC leaders and clubs, we can encourage open dialogue between the different stakeholders. We can continue to provide education for coaches and parents and set very clear policies that protect athletes and encourage their voice. And I feel like Wisconsin is doing this pretty well in lots of different areas. There's a lot of education, there's a lot of information. If you haven't looked at our newsletter that comes in an email bi-weekly from Angela, you should really start reading that because that really speaks to the open dialogue and lots of educational opportunities there. All right. So key takeaways, what I would like to talk about today. Remember that athletes themselves contribute to and thrive in psychologically, physically, and socially safe climate. So the one person in the middle has a huge role in creating an environment that they feel safe in. Coaches are central in cultivating all of those phases of how to create psychologically safe environment and maintaining the safe environment at practice as it meets. So now we're looking at the 2 interlayers of the systems that exist in sport. Officials, by reinforcing the rules, which are those policies and things, and part of the institutional rules that we have from USA Swimming, they're essential in creating a psychologically safe climate at meets. And parents who also sit in between the USA Swimming and the athlete, they're essential in supporting the safe environment by emphasizing the learning and effort over perfection. And we as LSC leaders shape this swim culture. So we really look at the institutional and cultural systems by making a psychological safety a priority in our sport. So in some ways, I'm going to put this in a very simplistic step-by-step. It's a win-win for us. So if we create psychologically safe environments, that facilitates the basic human needs. So you feel like you have a choice. People in it feel like they can, so competence, and they feel like they belong. These three basic human needs increase our motivation, which is intensity and effort we put into our activities, which then results in intentional practice. Then intentional practice makes us feel more comfortable and confident, which decreases performance anxiety. And then that decreased anxiety will allow us to perform better, which then increases the confidence. And then we return back to the psychologically safe environment, which takes the cycle even the next step higher and higher. So it's a win-win that we create an environment that fosters that psychological safety. And it all boils down to how we then act and behave in our practices, in our meets and performance, and overall in life. So the recap of today, I hope I was leaving you with some foundational understanding what is psychological safety and why it's important in swimming and indeed in all sports. And I gave you some things to think about how you can promote and use different strategies to, as a coach, parent, official, or LSC leader, to promote psychological safety in swimming. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions? Do you want to stop recording? I think that would be good.